Have you ever wondered about the greatest constructions in the Bible that leave scientists speechless? What if I told you that some of these stories are so remarkable, so beyond human understanding, that they defy logic and explanation? We're talking about divine interventions that shaped the course of history. From the massive ark that saved humanity to the towering walls of Jericho that fell with a single shout, these biblical constructions aren't just historical events. They are powerful displays of God's might. Today, we're diving deep into these stories that challenge our very understanding of what's possible. But before we get started, think about this. What if God is calling you to build something in your life that seems impossible? What if He has a plan that, just like these biblical marvels, will leave everyone speechless? Stay with me until the end, because the truth we'll uncover could change the way you see faith, power, and your own purpose. And hey, don't forget, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more videos like this. Let's get into it. The construction of Noah's Ark. When you look at the construction of Noah's Ark, it's impossible not to feel a deep reverence for the greatness of faith that Noah had. Imagine, without the technology we have today, without modern tools, and with one single purpose, to save humanity and the species from the impending flood. Noah, guided by the power of God, was able to build a vessel that defies human logic, without any model or prior example. All he had was divine direction and his unwavering faith. Noah's faith, as seen in the biblical stories, wasn't a faith of empty words. It was an active faith that led to action. In the midst of a disbelieving society and a world about to be destroyed, Noah followed the divine instruction to build something that seemed impossible. And even though he was misunderstood, Noah continued his mission step by step because he knew he was walking the path of faith. The ark was a symbol of his obedience, but also of his trust in the power of God. Building the ark was hard work and took many years. The Bible describes the ark as being 135 meters long, 22 meters wide, and 13 meters high, a colossal size for that time. However, this construction was only possible because God guided every detail, even the materials, like cypress wood. Without divine help, such a massive structure would never have been achievable. This teaches us something crucial about our Christian life. When we follow God's plans, even the greatest challenges can be overcome. It's interesting to note that, beyond saving Noah and his family, the ark was also a reflection of God's grace toward all creatures. From each species, a representative was brought aboard with the purpose of preserving life after the flood. This action of God makes us reflect on His mercy and care for all of creation. In our Christian life, we are constantly called to live in harmony with the divine plan, trusting in His power to guide our actions. And as archaeological evidence suggests, there was indeed a great global flood, which is not just a coincidence. Accounts of discoveries of Noah's Ark remains pop up from time to time, always generating great curiosity and speculation about its exact location. While these discoveries are still debated, they remind us that Noah's story is not just a legend. It is a truth that echoes through time, reminding us of God's faithfulness and the importance of faith in fulfilling His plans. As we reflect on the construction of Noah's Ark, we are invited to ask, in what areas of our lives are we being called to act with the same unshakable faith? What is God asking us to build or accomplish, even when it seems impossible? Noah shows us that with divine help, no challenge is insurmountable. Let's continue exploring how other great constructions in the Bible also reveal God's power in action. The destruction of the walls of Jericho. Have you ever heard the story of the walls of Jericho falling down after the Israelites marched around the city for 7 days, shouting and blowing trumpets? It's one of the most powerful moments in the Bible that truly illustrates the power of God in action. The city of Jericho was known for its strong, impenetrable walls, and yet, in a moment of divine intervention, those very walls crumbled to the ground at the sound of the Israelites' faith-filled cries. The Israelites followed the path of faith in obedience to God's command, and their trust in Him led to a victory that no human strength could have achieved. Imagine the scene. A city fortified with walls that could withstand the most advanced military tactics of the time. Yet God's plan was completely different. Instead of sending an army to destroy the walls, He commanded His people to march around the city for 6 days, and on the 7th day to give a mighty shout. And when they did, the walls fell flat, allowing the Israelites to march right in and claim the victory that was promised to them. This moment is often debated by scholars, with some proposing that the timing of the events might have coincided with a possible earthquake. But one thing is certain: the power of faith and obedience was a key factor in the destruction of Jericho's walls. It's a beautiful reminder of how God can use even the most unlikely methods to carry out His will. As we reflect on this story, we see how prophecies often come to pass in unexpected ways, and how obedience to God's voice can bring about extraordinary results, even when it seems illogical to the human mind. Archaeological evidence has also shed light on the destruction of Jericho. The ruins of the city show evidence of walls that collapsed suddenly, just as the Bible describes. Some scholars believe that the collapse of these walls was not due to a natural disaster, but rather the divine intervention of God. This teaches us that the power of God is beyond any explanation we can provide. It's a force that transcends natural laws, working in ways we may not fully understand but must trust in. The story of Jericho's walls also speaks to us today about the spiritual walls we build in our own lives. These walls often come in the form of fear, doubt, or sin, and they seem impenetrable at times. But just as God brought down the physical walls of Jericho, He can tear down the spiritual barriers that hold us back from experiencing His full glory and power. Through faith and obedience, we too can see walls fall in our own lives, making way for the blessings and promises God has for us. As we move forward in our exploration of the Bible's greatest constructions, let's keep the lesson of Jericho's walls in mind. Obedience and faith are often the keys to unlocking God's power in our lives. So, let's ask ourselves, what walls are standing between us and the promises God has made? And how can we trust Him to bring those walls down in His perfect timing? The construction of Solomon's Temple. The construction of Solomon's Temple is a monumental story that not only showcases human craftsmanship, but also highlights the power of God to inspire such beauty and grandeur. Imagine the most magnificent structure ever built, a temple filled with treasures, adorned with gold, cedar wood from Lebanon, and intricate craftsmanship. This temple was not just a building, it was the very place where God's presence would dwell among His people. It was built as a place of worship and a symbol of God's covenant with the Israelites. Solomon, guided by God's wisdom, was chosen to build the temple after the reign of his father, David. While David had the desire to build a temple, it was Solomon who was given the task. The construction took 7 years, and the temple was filled with the finest materials, designed to reflect the glory of God. The walls were covered with pure gold, the floors were made of precious stones, and the craftsmanship was unparalleled in its beauty. It was not just a place of worship, but a testament to God's provision and His presence among His people. During the dedication of the temple, something extraordinary occurred. As Solomon prayed, asking for God's blessing on the temple and the people, the power of God was visibly demonstrated. A cloud of glory filled the temple, and the fire from heaven descended, consuming the offerings. This miraculous event was a clear sign that God had accepted the temple as his dwelling place on earth. The presence of God was not only felt but seen, and this moment marked the beginning of a special relationship between the Israelites and their Creator. The temple, while magnificent, also teaches us about the importance of obedience to God's will. Every aspect of the temple's design and construction was done according to God's command, reflecting the need for us to live lives aligned with His will. Solomon's wisdom came from God, and it was through his obedience that such a glorious temple was built. In our Christian life, we are called to build our own spiritual temples, our hearts and lives, with the same dedication and reverence, following God's guidance. The destruction of the first temple later on in history is a powerful reminder that God's presence is not confined to buildings. Although the temple was destroyed, God's covenant and promises remained intact. This event also points to the importance of living faithfully, not merely through outward structures, but through a heart of worship that reflects God's holiness. Even when physical temples are destroyed, the power of God remains, and His presence can still dwell in us. As we continue to explore the magnificent stories of the Bible, let's reflect on what it means to dedicate our lives to God's glory, just as Solomon dedicated the temple. What are we building with our lives? Are we creating something that honors God's presence in our lives, or are we allowing distractions to take away from His glory? The temple teaches us that true worship starts within, in our hearts. The Tower of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel is one of the most fascinating and thought-provoking narratives in the Bible. In Genesis, we read about a group of people who, in their ambition and self-reliance, decided to build a tower that would reach the heavens. Their goal was to make a name for themselves, to become as powerful as God, and to prevent their dispersion across the earth. However, as we know from the story, God had a different plan. The power of God was demonstrated in a remarkable way when He confused their language, causing them to no longer understand each other. This caused the people to stop building the tower, and they scattered across the earth. The lesson from Babel is clear. No matter how determined human beings are, there are limits to what we can achieve when we step outside of God's will. Self-sufficiency may seem like a noble goal, but when it leads us to forget God and rely solely on our own abilities, it will always end in failure. The Tower of Babel also teaches us about the dangers of pride. The people wanted to build a tower to the heavens, as if they could reach or even surpass God. But their pride led to their downfall. The story is a powerful reminder that in our Christian life, humility is essential. No matter how high we climb or how much we achieve, we must always remember that it is God's power that enables us to do anything, and it is His will that guides our steps. The tower, with its height and ambition, symbolizes the human desire to make a name for ourselves and to reach a level of power and influence. But God, in His wisdom, showed that such ambition should never overshadow His greater purpose. In our lives, we must constantly check our motivations and make sure that we are building for God's glory, not our own. Whether we are seeking success, recognition, or wealth, we must remember that God's plan for us is far greater than any self-made achievement. The story of the Tower of Babel also gives us insight into the importance of obedience to God's direction. When the people were building the tower, they were not following God's plan for them. Instead, they were trying to act independently. But God, in His mercy, prevented them from completing their task, not out of spite, but to protect them from their own downfall. Just as in our lives, sometimes God's intervention may feel like a disruption, but it's actually His way of steering us back to His divine purpose. As we reflect on the Tower of Babel, we are reminded to examine our own lives and ask, are we building something for our own glory, or are we submitting to God's will? What towers are we trying to construct in our lives that may be keeping us from God's plan? The tower teaches us that no matter how tall our ambitions are, they must always be grounded in humility and obedience to God's direction. The reconstruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The reconstruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem is a powerful testament to the resilience and faith of the Jewish people. After the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites were allowed to return to their homeland, they faced the enormous task of rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed. Although the new temple was not as grand as the first one, it held a special significance. It symbolized the restoration of God's presence among his people, a promise that despite their suffering and exile, God was still with them. The Israelites, though deeply impoverished and oppressed, gathered their resources and began the task of reconstruction. The temple was rebuilt with materials that were not as lavish as the first one, but it was still a place of worship and a symbol of hope for the people. The prophecies spoke of a greater glory for this temple, one that would surpass the former, not in material wealth, but in the spiritual presence of God. In fact, the rebuilding of the temple marked the beginning of a new era, one where God's presence would once again fill the hearts of his people. King Herod, who later expanded the temple, took it to even greater heights. His expansion made the temple one of the wonders of the ancient world, with its grand architecture and impressive courtyards. However, the expansion, although magnificent, was still not the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecies. The true glory of the temple came not from its structure, but from the presence of God that filled it. And this is a profound lesson for us in our Christian life. While we may build great things, they are nothing without the presence of God in them. Sadly, the Second Temple's glory was short-lived. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed it, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy that the temple would be destroyed, Matthew 24:2. The gold that had adorned the temple melted and flowed through the ruins, leaving behind only rubble. Yet, even in the destruction, there was a greater promise. The presence of God was no longer confined to a building. Jesus came to offer a new covenant, one where his Holy Spirit would dwell in the hearts of believers, making them living temples. The true temple of God is no longer made of stone, but of living, faithful hearts. The story of the Second Temple's destruction and its promise of greater glory is a reminder for us today. Just as the Israelites rebuilt the temple with faith and hope in God's promises, we too are called to rebuild our own spiritual lives in the face of difficulties. We may face challenges and our faith may be tested, but just as God restored the Israelites and filled their rebuilt temple with his glory, he will also restore and strengthen us. As we reflect on the reconstruction of the Second Temple, we're reminded that our lives are also being built into temples for God's glory. It's not the grandeur of the buildings we create that matters, but the presence of God in our hearts. What areas of your life are in need of restoration? Are you building a temple for God's glory, or are you allowing distractions to take his place? The message of the Second Temple is clear. When we make room for God's presence, we experience the glory that no earthly building can contain. As we wrap up this journey through the greatest biblical constructions, it's clear that each one of these monumental events carries a profound spiritual lesson. Whether it's the Ark of Noah, the fall of Jericho's walls, the Temple of Solomon, the Tower of Babel, or the reconstruction of the Second Temple, each of these stories demonstrates God's power, his plan, and his glory in ways that transcend human understanding. So, what about you? What is God calling you to build in your life? What walls are you ready to see come down? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more life-changing content. If you want to dive deeper, check out the video that's coming up next. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Until next time, keep walking the path of faith. And remember, God's power is always with you.